Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our IDHEAP conference of tonight. And it's a great pleasure, an immense pleasure for me to welcome Cathie Jo Martin, who is a professor of political science at Boston University and an eminent American political scientist. Cathie is a specialist in comparative political economy and comparative politics. She has published in not all journals, but all best journals, which means, for example, American Political Science Review, World Politics, the British Journal of Political Science, Comparative Political Studies, Governance, Socioeconomic Review, European Journal of Sociology, and Politics and Society. That's not an exhaustive list, as you can imagine, but it's pretty impressive nonetheless. Cathie Jo Martin has innovated several times in her career. For example, I remember one of the first studies I read of hers was a study of active labour market policy, a comparative study of active labour market policies in the UK and Denmark, and it was maybe the first comparative study of active labour market policies at the time in the 90s. Then again, she innovated by studying business interests and the way in which employers can support or oppose social policies. A very nice book in the early 2010s. Later, she innovated once again by developing a totally new method to study the origins of policy differences across countries. And there is, of course, a big literature that is concerned with studying policy differences. We know that there are differences across countries, and most of us who do this, we do interviews, we look at legislations. Those who are interested in historical development go to archives. But Cathie developed a totally new method, which is based on literature. Looking at literature, looking at fiction writers, and the way in which in their books written at the very beginning of the various policies, looking at how these fiction writers conceptualized the ideas that are the foundational ideas of a given policy. And she's done that twice, as far as I know, maybe even more, but first for social policies and anti-poverty policy, with work that has been published in some of the journals that I mentioned. She mentioned it before, and now she did it again, but this time with education policy. And the book that she's going to present to us today is really an attempt or an application of this methodology to education. Education exists, education policy exists in every advanced country, but it can be very different. There are some countries that are more elitist, for example, like the UK, for example, and there are some countries that are more egalitarian. And why is it? It's a question that can be answered in different ways, and the way Cathie chose to answer this question was to look at fiction. And I don't know if you read all the books that are in your book, because fiction is huge. But maybe she didn't read them. But she used a computer program that went through all the corpus of literature. So it's also innovative in this respect. And I'm not going to say anything more about the content of the book, because it's much better to hear that from the person who has written it. And we proceed as follows. As you saw in the program, Cathie will have the word for the biggest part of the conference, of course. And then there'll be a discussion, unfortunately not by Flavia Fossati, because she's sick today. But we were lucky, and we're very grateful to Cecilia Ivardi, who was informed yesterday, I think, that there was this wonderful opportunity. And she accepted it, so we are very grateful, Cecilia, to this. But first, let's start with the presentation of the book. Cathie, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Giuliano, for that lovely introduction, and thank you to IDHEAP for inviting me today. I'm so happy to be here. On the methods point, I just have to mention that in my prior work, I did interviews with business elites, and so the last book, I interviewed 107 randomly selected firms in Britain and Denmark. And I realized at the end of this that at each point in the big interview projects I'd had, because I did another one before that, my travel arrangements messed up and I had to hitchhike. So I decided at the end of this last book that I was simply too old to get picked up anymore, and so I was going to have to move to a different methodology. I basically picked reading novels for really instrumental reasons. I mean, one was that I was going on sabbatical, and everyone said to me, "What are you going to do on sabbatical?" And I said, "Read novels." So I had to be, in fact, Giuliano, I didn't read all the novels, but I read a lot of novels. And the second was that I wanted to get money from the BU Humanities Foundation. I wanted to get a fellowship from them. And I decided that as a social scientist, if I said I was going to read literature, I'd have a better chance of getting the cash, which I did. So this is just all to say, when you're looking around for projects, be instrumental. Now, one thing, it worked. So today I want to talk about, and I'm not supposed to leave this small area, so I can't walk around the room like I usually do, but I might walk. I don't know if I'm still okay. I think I am. So I want to talk about two puzzles today. And one is a policy puzzle, and the other is a theoretical puzzle. And so the policy puzzle is, why is it that countries adopt new policy ideas in such radically different ways? So you get these new ideas that kind of sweep the world, and yet the implementation of these policies are radically different. So even when people think that they're doing the same thing, they end up doing very different kinds of things. The other thing about policy differences I think is puzzling is that you see the same kind of approaches to policies across different policy areas. And so in comparative political economy, the things we think that matter are struggles between interest groups or policy legacies or different ideas. And in fact, what you find that's kind of odd is even policy areas that have radically different interest groups tend to kind of move along in similar tracks. And so I figured something was going on. So I wondered about how culture matters to policy differences across countries. Now the problem with culture is that at one level it seems like it explains everything. Denmark is more collectivist than Britain. Yeah, we knew that. But does it actually help to understand, technical error. Does it actually help to understand why it is that Britain and Denmark, for example, when they created active labor market policies, they did it in such radically different ways? And that certain kinds of specific policy struggles resulted in certain kinds of outcomes. So I think that culture explains a lot over the long term, but it doesn't really tell you much about the Sturm und Drang of policy struggles in the day-to-day, why you get these big flip-flops, for example. So I think it casts a long shadow, but doesn't necessarily tell you in the moment what's going on. So I wanted to try to figure out a way to use culture where you could think more about the specific impacts of culture on specific policy battles. And that's what I did in this book. That's my little spiel for the book. Okay, second puzzle. Oh, first of all, before we go to the second puzzle, take education systems in Britain and Denmark. So education system development, I think, is a little counterintuitive. Here is Denmark, a kind of crappy little country on the outskirts of Europe. I always like to say that to a Danish audience. They actually had serfs at the end of the 18th century. Really kind of very marginal. And yet it creates the earliest education system in the world besides Prussia in 1814. And also agricultural Denmark creates this extensive vocational education and training program, which a lot of us in this room have been studying vocational education and training for a long time. Now, Britain, on the other hand, is kind of the leader of the Industrial Revolution, At the end of the 18th century, British workers were viewed as highly skilled, among the most skilled workers in the world, and yet they delay public primary education until 1870, and they end up creating a high school, a secondary school, that is only really for elites. It has one track, and it has only a lot of instruction in humanities, less so in math and science, and only 5% of British kids go to those schools when it's created in the early 20th century. So what I thought was that these reforms fit with certain kinds of cultural assumptions about society and school and cooperation in the state. And that in Denmark, both early mass education and this multi-track secondary education system might be related to a commitment to developing worker skills to contribute to a strong society. That there was a cultural need or perception that society trumped everything else. Whereas in Britain, the late public education school in the unitary secondary track showed very limited concerns about workers, and also the idea that schooling wasn't about society, it was about the individual. It was about creating this well-educated upper-class man that had to master great books in order to come to kind of come of age. And there was also an ambivalence over the state role and expectations of conflict. Now, I have to say that going into this project, this idea of education for society was brought home to me the third year I lived in Denmark with my husband and my small children. And my kids went to a Danish preschool. And at the end of the year in the preschool, the kids in Denmark go to something called colony. And colony means the kids go away for 3 days and they learn to peel carrots and get along and engage, run around in the woods and engage in like little society building exercises. And so I go in and I talk to the teacher and I say, you know, the 5-year-old, he's all over this, he's ready for it. But the 3-year-old, he's never been away from home before. And she looks at me and she says, well, it's about time. And I thought, classic Denmark, right? Everybody needs to participate in the group. And so when the reform in Denmark was passed a few years ago, that all kids had to be in preschool by the age of 1, I wasn't surprised. People thought this is anti-immigrant, and it was anti-immigrant, but it was also about building a strong society. So this society thing runs deep in Denmark. Okay, but how do you show it? Now, the second puzzle here is a puzzle of culture and institutional change. So we have all these theories about institutional change. And I think the weird thing about institutional change is that similar policy responses persist even though the policies are really dysfunctional. So there's this idea of policy legacies. And policy legacies means what you do in the past is going to predict what you do in the future. Kind of what you do at T0 means that you're going to do something similar at T1. And yet, again and again and again, you can get negative policy legacies from things. So I had a roommate who just routinely went out with the worst kind of guys. And no matter how much I pointed out to her, you're an idiot. He's a douchebag. Don't go out with him. She'd repeat it over and over and over again. And that seemed to me to be a great example, albeit trivial, of why it is that policy legacies don't always work. That you can have negative and positive policy legacies. The other thing is we see historical antecedents to contemporary debates. So even before parties and unions and employer associations are developed, all the things that we think matter to policy outcomes, you get these early initiatives when there's not a whole lot of institutions. that are the things that we think of as being important to institutional change. Okay, so what I decided to do is to develop an argument about authors. And I'm just going to say it briefly here, and I'm going to come back to it in a minute. And so authors in literature are key mechanisms for reproduction of cultural narratives through institutional change processes. Authors in literature are really important to these institutional change policies. That authors are understudied political actors and reform episodes, so they're agents, but also they create a structure of cultural symbols and narratives that help reproduce the way we respond to things over time. So if you didn't get all that, I'm going to come back to it. But first of all, I just want to, okay, why is this not working? Oh, yeah. I just want to talk a little bit about culture and institutional change theoretically. Now, I suggest that you already see culture being super important in theories about institutional change. Because if we think about institutional change, there are three drivers. There are ideas, their interests, and their institutional norms. And so you see in all this important literature written on institutional change, a role for culture in all three of these. First of all, culture shapes the adoption of new ideas and paradigms. So Cornell Band, for example, has this argument that cultural norms and deep-seated cultural attitudes shape the way that we pick up new paradigms. When Keynesian economics comes along in America, we create something called commercial Keynesianism, which is very different. It's about tax cuts, kind of inspiring growth in the economy, stirring up demand. When they do it in Norway, they have this fine-tuning of the economy that they basically eliminate the business cycle. And cultural norms affect the way that we pick up these new paradigms. So with active labor market policies, when that idea comes along, in Denmark, there's a lot of emphasis on training. That part of active labor market policy is really important. In America, some states, when they changed welfare, they used the money to build roads. That was their idea of, and there was almost no training in most states. So that's a big difference. So culture, I think, is something that mediates ideas. It also shapes interests. So a lot of people have written about how people build collective social identities differently across countries. And DiMaggio and Marcus talk about the differences between collectivism in Japan and individualism in America. It matters to class conflicts, the strength of class cleavages. It also matters to views of institutions, states, and markets. For example, some countries are much more cooperative than others. They develop these labor market institutions, macro-corporatist associations that help business and labor in the state negotiate outcomes. Culture legitimizes institutions, and it sets boundaries between states and markets. It's critical to nation building. Now, obviously, the influence doesn't just go in one direction. So I think that culture and cultural values and institutions co-evolve across time. And I can say more about that later. But the main point I wanted to make here is that culture is already important to institutional change. Now, all that's well and good, but I'm a political scientist. I'm a political economist, right? So I like to have concrete empirical views of how things matter, and I like to be able to measure things and operationalize things because I'm an empiricist. So before we talk more about culture, I think we have to have an agreement of what culture is. And what I suggest to you is there are a bunch of different ways that culture is defined in the literature. And one is that culture exists in institutional norms. people like Scott have talked about how institutions have a cultural aspect to them. Another approach is by Bourdieu and others who talk about cultural agents in social fields. And so Bourdieu has this idea that writers in the 16 and 1700s develop as a kind of autonomous group that's separate from the state and that influences the state in the way that they think about social problems and their solutions. The one thing, and I like that idea a lot, but the question is, do these cultural agents have any kind of staying power beyond single case studies? Because I think you can talk about how people are important in the moment, but you also, to make a really cultural argument, I think you have to show persistence across time. Now, another way is to think about culture in everyday practices, things like parenting, etc. But of course, we also have a lot of examples of people who defy these expectations. Not everybody does the same thing all the time, even if the society has some kind of cultural understandings of how things are going to work. So finally, we get to my personal favorite, culture as code. And this comes from the work of Clifford Geertz and other people that talk about culture as a web of meaning. And the idea here is that you have, according to Ann Swidler, a cultural toolkit. And this is metaphorically that when policy guys have a problem, they reach into that cultural toolkit and they pick out some kind of approach that seems to be consistent with how they believe the world works. And this cultural toolkit, according to Swidler, is used again and again and again. And so there's a kind of continuity in style, even when the goals change. Okay, so that's all very well and good, but where do you find this code? And how do you operationalize it? How do you study it? This is the most important in some ways. How do you study it in the past? Because we all too often have this tendency to take our present ideas about how the world works and assume that people in the past acted in the same way. And also, how is culture transmitted across time? So one final question is, do countries even have a cultural DNA? Now, on the one hand, it sort of seems like they might, because you can immediately see that Denmark is more collectivist than America, that class conflict in the Nordic countries is much more muted than in the United States. We have much higher levels of inequality. Cooperation is something that's valued in the Nordic countries and Northern Europe much more than competition, which is more of an Anglo thing. Anglo countries rely much more on markets than on states. You have strong states in some countries, not so strong states in another. So all that seems intuitively right. But these national cultural models raise some red flags. And the biggest red flag for me is that in the 1960s, guys like Sam Huntington wanted to conquer the world, right? We had really imperialistic ambitions in America back then. We wanted to export American political institutions. The idea of that right now in the time of Trump is just downright laughable. The idea that we ever thought that our political institutions were better than elsewhere is laughable, because we used to muddle along better, but we've never been particularly good at it. And yet we used all these cultural arguments to say America was the best in the world. Another problem is that when you think about cultural actors of the past, a lot of them are old white guys. And so there are always these kind of different strands and struggles between cultural actors, different views of what they want to happen. And a kind of national cultural model doesn't necessarily take that into account. The third thing is it can get kind of tautological. So, you know, culture matters, and we're going to show that because things are different, and they're different because of culture. So you get these competing fields, competing factions. And so Jeffrey Alexander, a sociologist, cultural sociologist, says that you have to have conditions for showing that culture matters. And one is that you have to have some kind of autonomy of the cultural field, some group of cultural actors that are autonomous from politics, at least somewhat. You have to have a transmission mechanism across time. And you have to have some sense of agency. So you have to be able to show that some cultural actors are actually trying to affect outcomes. So I have a two-part argument about culture. And getting back to what I said before, the first is that authors are political activists in these policy struggles. And it was only when I started this project that I realized that these writers have their fingerprints all over policy initiatives of the past. They were incredibly important. They were part of this avant-garde of intelligentsia that tried to put issues on the public agenda. And this was especially important in like the 18th century, before you had democratic institutions. It was one of the few ways that people outside the state could influence government. And so they used the power of the pen. They fought with cultural narratives. And they also played really specific roles in these reform movements. And the guys in the reform movements gave them a lot of credit for these roles. So, so chapters 3, 4, and 5 look historically at the role of these authors in these reform movements. And it's amazing how important they are and how much credit they get. So for example, the left party in Denmark, Venstre, there's a group of authors that form a group, modernist authors, and this is around the 1870s. And they form a group called the European Venstre, the kind of European or intelligentsia wing of Venstre. And they make a deal with the peasant wing of Venstre. They're fighting against the right party, Højre, which is dominated by this guy who's basically a dictator. And so Christian Berg, who's the head of the peasant wing of Venstre, says the authors came down like manna from heaven, and they gave us ideology which we lacked before, and it enabled us to fight the fight on cultural grounds. And so he gives them direct credit for this. And you see this a lot in these struggles. These authors know what they're doing. They're shaping the world in cognitive ways, but they're also making emotional appeals. So Dickens is wonderful at this. So Dickens writes A Christmas Carol specifically because he wants to fight child labor. And he writes to one of his political opponents a super snotty letter, and he says, my novel is going to have 20,000 times the force of any journalistic essay I could have written on this issue. And sure enough, child labor laws start getting passed in 1842 in Britain. In fact, child labor laws aren't passed until 1872 in Denmark, 30 years later, because they want kids to keep working so they could contribute to society. So they have really different views about child labor, which is another whole story. So authors also put issues on the public agenda, and so it's a way to influence elites before democracy. Now, all that is well and good, but you also need to look at literature as a kind of structure of cultural truths. And the idea here is that if in fact culture matters, we should be able to observe different patterns of symbols and narratives and ways of talking about things across countries. That each country should have its own profile. Now that doesn't mean that these symbols and narratives don't exist in different countries. They exist pretty much in all countries. But the symbols and narratives are kind of lumpy in their distribution. And so if culture matters, you should be able to see and look at and analyze the distribution of these narratives. So that's what I did with computational text analysis. And I kind of stumbled on this. I started, I got this BUCH money for a fellowship. And then I decided I wanted to try to understand culture more systematically. And so somebody said, go talk to the Hariri group at BU. And so I went to them, and they did a little interview with me after I'd been working with them for a while. And basically the theme of the interview is like the song New York, New York, if you could make it here, you can make it anywhere. And the message was, Cathie Martin is so dumb at this stuff that if we can help her do it, anybody can manage it. Hariri loved me after that. So writers collectively and over time contribute to the structure of these political narratives. They inherit these narratives from their predecessors, because authors all read novels. They rework them for new problems, and then they pass them on to future generations. And that's the transmission mechanism. Now, it's true that culture appears in other areas. Obviously, culture is kind of all around us. But what's nice about using literature is you can, in a very clear way, see what happens to these cultural narratives over time. And you can see in a very clear way how authors use these cultural narratives to win the battles that they're engaged in. And you can compare them cross-nationally. And you can do them with these machine learning techniques that enable us to analyze things in a super high level. And you can do it at the same time by reading texts closely, reading a lot of novels, and understanding from authors' own words how they think about the world. So I just want to make a couple of caveats. First of all, certainly individual authors vary. And you get big battles between authors. You get big battles over education and other kinds of issues. But the point is that countries battle on different playing fields. And so in Britain, for example, the fight was over whether workers had a right to schooling. It wasn't like the battle in Denmark, is schooling good for society? Because in Denmark, they're constantly talking about society. Samfundet, that's the word for society. You hear it constantly. In Britain, it is, do workers have a right? So those are very different playing fields. So I think about it as kind of tetherball, where the ball's attached to the pole and it bounces around, but it never goes very far. Now, political struggle still matters. In fact, it matters a lot because authors have to mobilize these symbols and narratives. And it's not an automatic thing. It's not like we just get on the cultural track and we do things that we never deviate from. But when you mobilize these narratives, they're very powerful. And so I talk about culture as setting a context rather than being directly causal. So I want to talk about my methods for a minute, and then I want to show you some of the evidence. So I use computational text analysis to analyze large corpora of British and Danish texts. I have 521 Danish novels and plays, and that's basically, I got it from something called the Archive of Danish Literature, and it's everything that is available in Denmark online. And then I built a similar one for Britain, and I didn't want to make, I had to make some choices to keep them the same size, but I didn't want Cathie Martin to be the one who's deciding the choices. So I left it kind of up to the experts. So I took every novel that was on these Wikipedia lists of literature from this period, and then I took lists of authors, and I made sure that every single author was represented. And I built little snippets of text. So I took these education words, and I built little snippets of 50-word texts around these education words. And then I analyzed what was going on inside these snippets of text. And so I calculated word frequencies, like how many times you got references to workers or the state or cooperation inside these little snippets of text. And then I also did case studies of authors writing and their networks with policymakers before the key reforms, school reforms from the late 18th century to the early 20th century. And I read a lot of books, which was the most fun part. And so I made a hypothesis that if cultural context matters, we expect to see these cross-national differences in literary symbols and narratives that persist across time. And so the first thing we expect to see is that cultural norms affect ideas, right? Because ideas is one of the drivers of institutional change. And specifically, we would expect that Denmark has more early references to education than Britain, and that cultural depictions should predate major reforms in each country, so that the authors start to build up writing about education in this kind of crescendo over time. And then once education reform passes, then they kind of move on to some other issues. So frequency of words associated with individualism should be higher in British snippets than in Danish ones. And frequencies of words associated with society should be higher in Denmark. And that's precisely what I see. So the first thing, I don't know if I have, oh, shoot. Okay, so anyway, I'm not supposed to, so you see the red arrow, that's before Denmark, and the blue arrow is before the British reform. So you see that timing matters. Authors write about things in advance. You also see that these individual words are much, much higher in Britain. So the black line here is Britain. The gray line is Denmark. And so British writers routinely talk about schooling in terms of individuals. Yes?
Maybe just one or two examples
Yeah.
of individual words?
An example of it? So I'm going to give some examples of texts in a minute.
I can wait.
But the words, the way, I'll talk a little bit about the words. So the way I got the words is I did that word cloud, which I showed a few minutes ago. And I coded 8 big novels. And then I coded all the words that appeared in word clouds in the novels into categories. And then I took those categories and then I went to online dictionaries and I added words from the online dictionaries. And then I made sure that the words were used during the period. And then the other thing that was tricky, this was actually really tricky, was because if you stem words, you take off the prefix and the suffix, then you have to make sure that you don't get a word that means something different. So like a word I couldn't use was society. And I couldn't use society in English because society in the 19th century almost always referred to high society. It did not refer to social samfund like it did in Danish. So I used the word social instead. And the other thing I had to do with all the books is I had to go through and change the dates. So the dates reflected the dates they were initially published. And so if you go on Google Ngram and you try to study what happens over time, you're not going to get very good results because the dates are wrong and they have lots of replications. But so that's one of the ways I did it. So getting back, so here's individual words. Here's society words. So this is the gray is Denmark. Many, many more references to society in Danish literature, again and again and again. And the book is kind of full of these references and what authors did to try to influence the debate. So Matthew Arnold, who's a poet, is super important in British education system development. And he goes out of his way to say that the primary goal of education is not to make good citizens. That's not what education is about, but rather to create the best individual. The best man is he who most tries to perfect himself. And this theme runs through everything that Matthew Arnold wrote, as well as just tons and tons of English literature from the 19th century. Now, alternatively, in Denmark, you get Ludwig Holberg. Ludwig Holberg is one of my favorite people in history. So in 1649, Ludwig Holberg writes this great novel. It's like one of the first adventure stories called Niels Klim Journeys to the Center of the Earth, basically, or Niels Klim Journeys Underground. And Niels Klim is this kind of hapless idiot who goes to this subterranean planet and discovers this utopia. And the utopia actually is made up of tree people. So Tolkien was a huge Holberg fan. And the tree people in Lord of the Rings actually comes from Holberg. Just little fact. So Holberg writes all these wonderful things. And one thing he writes is, merit ought to be rewarded, but the reward should be adapted that the state may not suffer. In other words, schooling and jobs, those should be allocated according to what society needs and not what the individual wants. And that's a constant theme. Grundtvig, who is kind of a famous guy outside of Denmark as well, because he did these folk high schools, he said that education for the little people was a matter of national identity and essential to the collective folk. And when you first get education developing at the end of the 18th century, there's this coup, and there's a schizophrenic king, and there's a coup to overthrow him. And so the crown prince and his advisors gain power in 1884, and they create a land reform commission to try to change the way that land is distributed, because they want to create a middle class devoted to honing agricultural productivity and adopting new methods. And in addition to that land reform commission, they form an education commission and a poverty commission. So from the very beginning, even though we talk about growth and equality going together today and the way that we can kind of make that work, the Danes are talking about that at the end of the 18th century. So it was always about society and building society. And for Grundtvig, having well-educated farmers meant that they would invest in society, they would develop all these fancy agricultural products that made Denmark really rich. And Denmark goes from being this shitty little country on the outskirts of Europe to being this paradigm that it is today. And education is a big part of that. Okay, another thing is that culture should matter to the expression of interests. So if cultural work sets context for the construction of interests, you should see radically different perceptions of social class in Britain and Denmark. So I don't want to belabor this point because I've already kind of said it, but you should expect that workers would be talked about in snippets of text about schooling in Denmark much more than in Britain, because in Britain it's all for the upper class. And also Danish authors should associate workers with skills much more than in Britain. Because in Britain, education, schooling, it was not about building skills. It was about creating these well-developed, smart, Brahmin, upper-class guys. It wasn't skills development. And so this ignoring the skills component is one of the reasons why I think Denmark and Britain kind of traded places. And Britain started doing so badly with skills. And so this provides the context for the early education. And so I want to show you a couple of things. First of all, these are worker words in education snippets, and you can see much higher in Denmark. And by this last period, 1870 to 1920, you really see the attention to workers increasing more than ever. Also, skills words in education go way up by the end of the 19th century, but they're always higher. Skills is always talked about as something that's a goal of education. Now, authors' writings about education reinforce this. So again, Ludwig Holberg says that laws favoring some classes are not conducive to the general interest. He says this in 1749. Thomasina Gulenberg, wonderful book called Montanas de Ingres. She connects economic productivity, skills building education, and social solidarity. And it's like, the book reads like a formula for social democracy. It comes out in 1837. Now, in Britain, on the other hand, you've got guys like Wordsworth and Coleridge, who were basically great revolutionaries during the French Revolution. But then Wordsworth moves to the right, and he hates the idea of education for workers. He says mechanic institutes make discontented spirits and insubordinate and presumptuous workmen. And what I find really distressing, well, this like hurts me because I love all these Victorian novels. I just love them. Even people like Elizabeth Gaskell, is that funny? Is it? I don't. I just love them. But even people like Dickens and Gaskell, who write achingly about poverty and impoverished women and children, they are famously sympathetic to the tribulations of the working class, but they still worry about things like a culture of poverty. So there's all this discussion in British literature about how educating workers can actually dumb down British culture. H.G. Wells is a socialist, for God's sake, and yet he still talks about the swarms of birth. He worries about the kind of working class procreating. This is all very Malthusian. Malthus thinks that if you give people benefits, they're going to overproduce, and it's going to destroy society. So the idea of destroying society in Britain versus building society in Denmark, these are radically different ideas. So again, I want to show you this. This is a cluster analysis, and this shows how writers talk about labor. So in Denmark, you get, just focus on the colors, don't look at the distribution. Everything's brown, basically. And what that tells you is that all the authors pretty much agree on one view, a single view of workers. Whereas in Britain, you have all sorts of different colors. There's a lot of battling about workers. There's a lot of division there. Now finally, because I want to move things right along, if culture work sets the context for institutional rules of negotiation, you would think that Danish authors make more references to the state and also to cooperation. And so that is in fact very true. So let me just show you, here are state words and education snippets. Denmark is higher than Britain. Finally, at the end of the 19th century, you get the work of people like Green, T.H. Green, who's a philosopher who writes a lot about how you have to have a more collectivist approach to education. Finally, Britain starts seeing a role for the state in education. But then you also see cooperation words being radically different. And there are these constant, it's like a drum roll of attention to cooperation in Denmark and praising cooperation, whereas in Britain, fighting the good fight is everything that matters. So again, some examples. William Morris, who's a guy who makes wallpaper, right? He's also a famous socialist. And William Morris is deeply sympathetic to workers. He is deeply sympathetic to socialist ideas. And yet he writes this book called News from Nowhere. Few people have read it, but it was widely read in the end of the 19th century. And everything disappears. Union disappears, the state disappears, institutions disappear. The guy wakes up like 200 years later and there's nothing left. It's just people, artisans making goods and trading with each other. That's society to him. That's his idea of a utopian society. And one British wag of the period said that if you really had a society that operated in this way, everybody would have to work 500 hours a week just to make all the goods. Bernhard Severin Ingemann, on the other hand, sees the king as the guardian of the collective good that unites the people in harmony for the good of all. And cooperation is a constant theme. So this wonderful play called The Death of Balder is about cooperation. And Hawthor thinks he has to fight Balder for the sake of honor, and his fiancée Nana thinks that this is kind of a useless waste of time. And so there's this like little romantic comedy aspect to it, where kind of he said, she said, and he says, you know, I have to defend my honor. And she says, yeah, but it's not going to go very far if I'm a widow, basically. And you contrast this by No Enemies by Charles Mackay. And I love this. I think this captures the essence of fighting the good fight. You have no enemies, you say, alas, my friend, the boast is poor. He who has mingled in the fray of duty of the brave endure must have made foes. If you have none, small is the work that you have done. It's like fighting the good fight in Britain. Okay, so what does all this mean, and why should we do it? First of all, I think that culture is really important in historical institutional analysis. We can measure culture empirically in all kinds of ways. I do it for literature with machine learning techniques. I think there's a zillion different things one can do, and it's really exciting. It should be a new direction, I think, in social science. We can look empirically and show physical evidence of cultural tropes. I think that social scientists do make assumptions from the perspective of modern logics, and this enables us to read history forward. Fiction also mattered a lot more before the 20th century and the burst of other media. So I'm not saying read novelists today and then you'll understand how the world works. There are other kinds of cultural tropes today that matter and that have a lot of influence, but novels are probably not them. And yet at the same time, I think that novels were deeply important in the period that I look at, and that cultural forms remain a source of continuity in processes of political and institutional change. And they're an alternative to policy legacies, because our cultural assumptions about how the world works, we bring them to bear every time we sit down to solve a problem. We have kind of knee-jerk cultural responses to things. And so I think that's kind of same as it ever was. Why people keep making the same sorts of mistakes or doing things right. Now, I also think that this sheds new light on the cultural bases of social democracy. So I think that the Nordic solution to pose social investment as a way of reconciling growth and equality has been around for a long time. And these policies go way back to at least the 1700s. However, it's not because the social democrats in the Nordic countries were interested in equality. They really weren't. They were not particularly interested in equality, but they were interested in society. And these cultural conceptions of society and the working class were the basis for these policies. And equality was a felicitous side effect in the 20th century. Because what they did is they brought wages up by investing in education for all people, and that narrowed the gap. And so finally, I just have to say that coming as an American to this conversation, I had to issue a trigger warning to my Christmas letter this year. Seriously, I mean, it's awful to be an American right now. And it drives home the power of culture wars, which I think are sweeping the world and rocking the political foundations of many, many, many societies. Mass publics today are expressing deep discontent with elite technocratic solutions that became popular during the last 40 years of neoliberalism. And I think that a lot of progressive people are pretty tone deaf about how the meritocracy and these technocratic solutions fail to address the angst of many working class folks and people who are in marginal positions of society. And far-right parties have been able to use these cultural images of traditional societies to build support for their heinous policies. And so I think that scholars and activists and people who believe in progressive politics should pay attention to the role of cultural touchstones in political battles. And they should think about making political appeals that are based on people's cultural yearnings. So I think it's no time like the present to think about culture. On that note, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. This was a really fascinating talk. And I would like to give the floor to Cecilia Ivardi, who is a PhD student at the University of St. Gallen, member of the GovPet team, and she wrote a book review about this book. So that's one reason why you were asked to comment on it, and you have about 10 minutes for your comments. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Giuliano. Thank you very much, Cathie, for this wonderful presentation and the book.
Thank you.
I just want to say that I come from a comparative political economy background, and I would say that this book is particularly interesting for scholars of comparative political economy, but also of cultural sociology. It really manages to build a bridge between these two disciplines, and it embeds culture within the building blocks of political economy and political science more at large. But really it can be read by anyone who is interested in education policy and politics of institutional change. Before going into the argument, I really would like to emphasize how impressive and original this methodological approach is. Because this work uses sophisticated computational text analysis of large corpora of fiction from the 1700s to 1920. And it manages to create a measure of culture that is independent of the outcomes of culture. And in this way proves that differences in education policy relate to opposite ideas about the roles of the individual in society, the working class, and the state. And this method, I think, really gets at something that we previously have not been able to get to in political science. It made me think of this article from 2003 where Mark Blythe says structures, so institutional rules, do not come with an instruction sheet. And I think you get to the instruction sheet. This is precisely what he meant. And you give physicality to an issue that is usually so pervasive that it's very difficult to track down and to identify. And in addition to that, you fill a very important historical gap, because we do not have assessments of public opinion from those days. And we are not able to, obviously, survey people who lived in those times. And this is very important because, as you have shown, these discussions really matter for the way social policy, education policy is set up to this day. And in my view, this book makes two great contributions, among others. And first is that it shows that cultural views mediated policymakers' reform agendas, as well as social groups' preferences for specific educational strategies. And it helps understand educational choices beyond spending levels. It really helps us understand how issues came on the agenda. And it adds to the literature that has highlighted other powerful forces that shape education policy, such as processes of nation building, processes of institutionalization and democratization, and is also complementary to those that argue for the role of government institutions such as bureaucracies, as well as interest group conflicts and religious traditions in shaping education policy. And the second great contribution of this book is to show that fiction writers were agents of change. And it complements studies on other drivers of educational reforms by showing that fiction authors have constructed the discursive space within which educational issues have been discussed. And what they've also managed to do is to create emotional messages about education that can be very easily digestible by non-experts as well as experts. And authors have managed to exert political activism in their role of public intellectuals, participating in public processes of reforms, joining other intellectuals, and putting issues that had previously been neglected on the political agenda. And what I really appreciated about your analysis is that the agency of authors is never stereotyped, and it is very clear that there were many internal conflicts within the groups of public intellectuals, and nevertheless there is a red line that traces developments in the two different countries. And I think this work really pushes the boundaries of our knowledge of institutional change, and especially beyond the usual dichotomy of agency and structure. I think we are used to thinking about these two things in separate ways, but what this work shows is that they are really the very same thing. Usually cultural artifacts trace the boundaries within which societies develop, but these boundaries are very fluid, and culture is constantly being reconfigured by the same actors who produce it. So I think it really points to thinking about this dichotomy in a more, in a different way. And it begs the question of, does it still make sense to separate these concepts? And on this note, I have some points of discussion that I would like to ask your opinion about. I think one you hinted to already in your presentation. It is the question of how would this look nowadays. Right? Nowadays, national borders do not constrain the spread of culture as they used to. Culture is often digital and therefore, I think, perceived as much less durable in many respects than it was. And there is a huge pluralism of voices, and yet certain spaces are still only accessible to certain groups. And I think you have a beautiful quote that I will read now in the book, where you ask, should we worry that national literary corpora were dominated by white men in the past, which is why contemporary scholars search for the alternative voices of women and people of color in constructing the wonderful cultural potpourri of nation states. So I would like to know what you think about this. Is it even possible nowadays, even within the same bubble, to have some legitimate enough to still influence education policy? And a second point that I was wondering about is whether you could talk a bit more about the durability of culture. So does a society need a coherent body of cultural products to be consumed by generations for the culture to be transmitted from one generation to the next? I think nowadays we are discussing a lot whether certain classical works still need to be studied in schools, or whether we need to change, perhaps listen to new voices. So how does that influence the durability of culture? And finally, I think what I haven't mentioned yet, but what is really great about this argument is that towards the end of the book, you conduct a survey on 2,000 British and Danish young people, and you show that the views that they have on education policy are still the same as what you find in your analysis. And I think this poses a fundamental question for those of us who are interested in how education policy should be reformed in an age where it is extremely under pressure because of the rise of the knowledge economy, the need for skills for the green transition. So will these views, these very deep ingrained views, require fundamental renegotiation? And yeah, what do you think about this? Do you think it's the case, or do you think fundamentally this continuity is there to stay? Yeah, Thank you very much.
These are great comments and great questions, and I would love and very curious to hear the answers to this. You took notes?
Yeah.
Cathie, okay, that's excellent. So I suggest that you reply to these questions, and then we will go for a general discussion.
Okay.
Back to you.
Okay, well, first of all, Cecilia, thank you so much. You read the book so carefully, and I know that from her review, and it's like, I feel like you read it more carefully than anybody else has besides me, maybe even more. You ask questions that are kind of at the heart of the problem, right? Which is a great attribute of a discussant, and sometimes it's hard to respond to those great questions as it is now. The first thing is, I think that culture continues to be replicated in many different ways through video games. I just read this novel about video games, Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow, and I was thinking a lot about the power of video games in structuring the thinking of a certain group of people in society. In online internet sources, in movies and films. But the problem is that there is no consistent source of culture today, and there's not even a consistent source of the news today. So we talk a lot about the proliferation of news outlets and what that's done to people's capacities to agree upon facts and understandings. And I think that culture is a similar problem, and that one of the reasons why societies now are losing coherence is precisely because there's so many different sources of the news and cultural influences, and we don't have kind of dominant strands the way we used to. And I mean, if you just even think of going back to the 1960s, when there were only a few TV shows, or TV channels, 1 or 2 or 3 TV channels, everybody watched the same thing. And everybody listened to the nightly news. And it was a kind of unifying theme that was reproducing our intellectual understanding of how the world works and our cultural touchstones. And I don't think that that happens anymore. And so I think that you still get these cultural trends, such as the ones I found in these surveys, but I don't have a really good answer for how culture is perpetuated, other than to say that I think that societies are falling apart, and that's one of the major problems of our times. The durability of culture and new voices in culture. I think that this question about how people fight for dominant cultural narratives is super interesting, and they did it back in the 18th and 19th century, and they do it even more today. And I think it's wonderful that you get these new voices. At the same time, what I said before about different cultural playing fields, I think that continues to be true today. And it's true that there are more international sources of culture, but there were always international sources of culture. One of the things I think is fascinating is how these authors that I was studying would write novels that they thought were the same novels, but were radically different. So Hans Christian Andersen was in love with Dickens. He just thought Dickens was the bee's knees. He went and stayed with him for a month one time. And yet they wrote radically different books. Like Hans Christian Andersen's books were really different from Dickens. Bernhard Severin Ingemann, who I mentioned before, he loved Walter Scott. And you know, these guys would correspond and stuff. But Ingemann at one point says that that Scott has no grand ideas, and that's his criticism of Scott. So Ingemann thought that part of his role was to put forth these grand ideas about society, and then Scott gets caught up in romance, which is practically absent from Ingemann's book. So reading this stuff together really drove home to me how you get these fads across the world, but they're picked up in different cultural ways. And I think that that continues to be true today. If you watch something like House of Cards, right? And the American version of House of Cards and the British version of House of Cards are really different. And then you watch like Les Spirales, which is not House of Cards, but it's kind of also about political machinations. And so I love watching like Netflix, basically, is what I plan to do when I retire, is just watch Netflix all the time and read novels. But I think somebody could do a really interesting study on how some of these themes, these typical similar shows are picked up in such radically different ways. Are the views deeply ingrained anymore? I mean, I am so pessimistic about the future that I think I should not be allowed to make predictions, because I mean, I'm still stuck on climate change, to tell you the truth. So but I think that there are ways that we continue to respond, and I think that being aware of our responses and the cultural blinders that we use in our responses may make us more may give us a leg up in terms of not making the same mistakes that we seem to make over and over again. So that's I like to think of this as something that it could be used by activists as a way to get deeper purchase on some of the problems of the world, and especially the problems of political polarization and discontent. So thank you so much again.
Great. So let's open the floor for a general discussion. Who wants to ask the first question? Justin?
Thank you so much, Cathie, for presenting this innovation that you have I've been aware that you've been working on this, and it's really exciting to hear how you did it. And my question is one of influence, because we in the Academy also have our literatures and have people that we cite and reflect and certain keywords that are most important for us. And I'm wondering how you, among these hundreds of novels, were there particular novels that had a tremendous influence, that through the ages we can do time travel because they were so influential and have been really the touchstones for later authors? You mentioned the relationships of some of the major authors, but it would be interesting to hear more about within these large groups of novels, which were the most influential, and which should we read to really understand the time that you're talking about?
Great. Can I answer these
Sure.
one by one? Okay, that's a really great question. And so what I think, so I kind of think about this is working on a couple of levels, as I said before. And so one thing I do in the book is I talk about where authors get their own ideas about how the world works. And so I think there are three sources. And one is that you do have these great authors, people like Charles Dickens, who have an outsized influence on both in terms of genre, but also in terms of his political views. And so you have these people who kind of come along and their own creative inner juices are just really agenda setting. And those are super important. The second is authors' life experiences obviously matter. So part of what these guys are doing is they're depicting the world that they live in. And that's one of the reasons why I think that they talk about things in somewhat different ways. But then a third way has to do with these inherited narratives that I've been talking about. And so I don't want to say that there's this direct line between you know, literature inherited from the past and literature in the present. But it's more, and that's why I talk about it more as a cultural constraint rather than a causal determinism. And so people talk about context conditionality, and that's the kind of argument that I'm making, is that they set the context, that there are many different avenues you can go in, but the context is pretty darn important, and it exists a long-term influence over time. So when you get Uncle Tom's Cabin, for example, written, that didn't cause a civil war, but it really helped to energize people and make them even more sympathetic and aware than ever of what was going on, how horrible slavery was. And so I see these authors' great works as often having a lot of impact, but even the people who are more obscure contribute to this kind of collective zeitgeist. So, thank you.
I think, Philip, you had a question?
Yes, thank you very much for this very fascinating and inspiring talk. I have two related questions. The first one is maybe, which is the, what are you looking at? Are you really looking at culture or rather at ideas? And maybe related to that, memories. So I'm saying that just because I was thinking of the position of Denmark and the UK in the competition of European nations in the 19th century, and the experiences were very different at the time. You know? I mean, Denmark had shrunk sizably, more or less failed colonial history, it became a very small country, Great Britain was still great at the time in terms of its imperial size, and so then I'm wondering whether what you find in this novel is maybe also a response to how to organize society in the global competition, where Denmark, everyone would stick together. In a sense, it was formulated by the politics of small nations in a book in the 80s by Katzenstein, I think. So is it rather about that, and then what you find in the books is a reflection of that rather than a cause for policy change? So I'm trying to push you a bit on the causal question.
Okay, great. Well, that's a great question. So, I don't think of it as causal, but more setting the context. But what I think is really interesting is that these cultural narratives persist through radically different contexts. And so when Holberg was somebody who had an outsized impact on the fortunes of Denmark, because what he does is he makes all this money, he writes these books like Niels Clem, he gives all of his money to the Sorrow Academy. The Sorrow Academy then trains all the progressive estate owners who are the members of the coup, who set up these important commissions. And Danish historians refer to this as the foundations of modern Denmark. So in this case, you can almost draw a straight line between Holberg and what happens, because everybody references him for centuries thereafter. So for example, yes, you're right, 1864, Denmark loses Schleswig-Holstein, and yet the narratives, and the modernists come along, the narratives and cultural references are basically the same. And so they persist through these changing genres, through these radical upheavals. At the end of the 18th century, Denmark is actually not a small country. It's a medium-sized country. It owns northern Germany, it owns Norway, it has Iceland, it's multilingual, and all these ideas become really important during this period. Their interpretation of the Enlightenment is very unique. But these ideas kind of persist through these changing times, and I think that there's definitely a dynamic of small countries that's different from large countries, but small countries can be very different. So Belgium, for example, isn't nearly as collectivist as Denmark, for example. I wrote an article with some colleagues, Denny Nihus and Eric Olson, my former student, and we looked at industrial relation systems development in Britain, Denmark, the Netherlands, and Sweden. And these are 3 coordinated countries, Britain, the Netherlands, and Denmark. But they have, I'm sorry, Sweden, Denmark, and the Netherlands. But they have radically different industrial sectors. So, so the Netherlands in the 1600s becomes this, major commercial trading country. Denmark is very agricultural, and then it develops small and medium-sized firms. Sweden develops these huge firms. They're radically different in lots of ways, but they have the same cultural emphasis on 2 things: coordination and skills. And so that even though the Netherlands has many more references to markets than the other countries, they have some cultural similarities. And so the way I think about this is each country has a kind of a little package of cultural tropes that seem to matter in the way they respond to things. So then finally, I just want to say that I really do think that it's a multi-causal story. Because I'm a firm believer that political struggle matters and it can change the course of history. But just cultural icons can help you with political struggle. They can be a real aid in political struggle, and they can also make institutional changes more enduring. So that Denmark, for example, kind of joins other countries in the beginning of the 21st century in trying to move to adopt these new neoliberal ideas about education and have, more test scores and stuff like that. But they've moved away from it because it just didn't have staying power. And culture affects staying power.
Next question, Anatina.
I'm an admirer of your work, and thank you for a great talk. I would like to ask you about something you said, that there is no consistent source of culture.
Can you speak up a little bit?
Yeah, you said that there's no consistent source of culture today. And in your book, you analyze novels, and I was wondering about the selection mechanisms. So which novels get produced, and what kind of gatekeepers are there selecting these novels, and are these novels read by the elite or the masses? And then the question is also a bit, if today's culture is, say, also selected or co-produced by consumers, like in social media or something like that, does this, and today there is no consistent source of culture, do you see this co-producing or democratization of culture as problematic for society's coherence or something like that? I was wondering about that. Do we need an elite culture to have cohesive societies?
That's a great question, Anatia. Thank you so much for that. So there are a couple of parts there. First of all, I talk a lot in the book about publishers and other people as gatekeepers. And there's definitely gatekeeping in both countries. There's a lot of gatekeeping in the 18th and 19th century. It's also a little bit easier to publish books then than it was, at least until the internet made self-publication possible, because there was a lot of printing, and the kind of left would print their own books, and people like Thomas Paine, who of course was British and moved to America, was printing pamphlets, and so there were a lot of word wars that were going on. But I also think that publishers did manage to control stuff a lot in both countries. I don't think that you need, I think social media is, and self-publication is a great way to get alternative voices. So when I say that there's a proliferation of culture, I guess I'm going to contradict myself now, which is a good thing to point out, because I think it is really good that people are presenting alternative ideas. Part of the problem, though, is that we're not reading all the alternative ideas. We're just reading our own narrow little Reddit site. And that's what I think is a bit problematic when you have a society that's so balkanized culturally. So I want to hear alternative ideas, but I want everybody to hear those alternative ideas. And I don't I don't think it's healthy for society to have, you know, Pizzagate, for example, which is, you know, one of the myths that the far right promoted about child pornography. That's dangerous when you get these people in their own little worlds, not talking to each other. So that's how I'd answer that.
You have a question?
Thank you very much for a really interesting and inspiring talk. I had a similar question about historical publication bias, but that partly took me in another direction, which is Dickens, for example, was not published as novels, it was published as serializations in newspapers, or what we would now call newspapers. And that took me in the direction of wondering, could you apply a similar framework to other media? So would you find the same thing in art, music, anything else that could go on the list? A little bit out there as a question, but very interested in it.
No, really important question. So yeah, and Anatine, I forgot to answer that part of your question. So who read it? So in the end of the 18th century, it was mainly elites. And it was elites reading this stuff, but influencing the state. But by the middle of the 19th century, everybody's reading stuff. So Dickens comes back from America, and the dock workers shout up to him, "Whatever happened to Little Nell?" You know, everybody's reading, and especially because they come out in Household Words and all these literary journals, and they're passed around, so everybody's reading novels. The cheap novels are invented around 1790, and that makes a huge difference. So I think that reading is much more widespread, and it's the main source of entertainment, and then people who could read would read to people who couldn't read, kind of thing. So I think that I think that the historical publication, that this becomes a form that's influential to the masses pretty early on. In terms of art, music, other kinds of cultural medium, absolutely. And I would love to see more work done on influence of different kinds of media. And you know, I started with literature because it was unnatural to me. But you know, you get great things like Beethoven's Ninth, you know, that sort of make grand statements, continues to be used as a symbol of Europe today. But I think it would be super interesting to kind of think about how art, for example, which is pretty widely shared in museums and exhibitions were a huge thing in the 19th century, to kind of think about how they influenced ways of approaching various kinds of social problems, because I'm sure that there are many stories to be told there.
Astrid? Yeah.
Thank you very much for the super interesting presentation.
Thank you.
I think it also speaks a lot, you said that yourself, to the distinction between a comprehensive country with respect to a more selective country, and when does channeling happen and what age. And so my question was, to what extent do you think teachers as a collective force,
what is it?
Teachers?
Oh, teachers.
As a collective force, are a mediating force in this process? And do you think, did you form an opinion in your incredible research process as to whether maybe it was stronger in Denmark as opposed to the UK, or the opposite? Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I'm really interested in how class cleavages get mobilized, and so teachers start to become organized in Denmark in the latter part of the 19th century, in the 1850s. They don't really, teachers' unions don't really exist before that, and teachers are a pretty underdeveloped group. They don't have a lot of political power. They don't have a lot of economic power. In fact, they often have to serve several schools, and they have to deliver the posts on the side, and they're in pretty bad shape. So teachers start getting more mobilized, but as with other kinds of class conflict, there's not a lot of conflict there, or class cleavages between teachers and other people. So one of the things I find fascinating is the church-state battle in Britain is so intensely strong. And in Denmark, as teachers get more professionalized, members of the church decide themselves that they want to pull back, because they don't want to have to deal with all of the education stuff. And when teachers start saying that they want more power and they want to de-emphasize religion, it's not perceived as a big attack on the church. It's perceived as, well, yeah, we have to spend more time in building skills. So I have some stuff about that in chapter 4 of the book, about the teachers' roles. And then teachers are also very connected to these literature people. So there's a political party that develops in 1907 in Denmark called Radikale Venstre. And Radikale Venstre, the radical left it's called, is a new political party, and it's made up of authors and teachers, and it comes out of these earlier coalitions that start to come together in the latter part of the 19th century. So you can kind of trace some of these, and I try to do this as much as possible to sort of trace the way that these coalitions and these political strands develop. But there's much more class conflict with teachers in Britain.
Okay, so this is a fascinating discussion that could go on for hours, and it can maybe also outside, because there is a wonderful reception waiting for us. But before that, presents. So this is a small souvenir from IDHEAP, the IDHEAP bottle. I'm very proud of.
Oh, good. Thank you so much. Oh my gosh. A baby.
You're generous, but not that generous.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Cathie.
Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate it. Oh, wow.
So thanks a lot, Cathie. Thanks a lot, Cecilia, for your brilliant discussion. And we are all invited to share a nice reception outside.
And thank you so much.